Welcome to the Mac's Future Weekly Podcast. All Apple talk and no chit chat.
Okay, welcome to the Apple Podcast, episode 89, and this is Lex at MacsFuture.com, and today is September 16th, 2011, and there's various Apple news to talk about. Remember, this is a no chit-chat, all Apple talk podcast, so let's get to it. Okay, so one of the big stories that affects Apple this week is that Microsoft finally released the preview of Windows 8 to developers, so people got to have a close look at the next version of Windows 8. And why is this significant for Apple? It's significant because I guess for the last 4 years, Apple has been just growing and growing and growing and has surpassed Microsoft in market capitalization and has almost really surpassed Microsoft for seizing the future of computing. And Windows has just been sort of stagnant, and Microsoft has been stagnant, and all sorts of metrics have come out in the last few years showing that quarter after quarter the PC in the United States, the Windows PC, is shrinking. And so Microsoft's in a deep trouble, and it's in particularly deep trouble because we're in a post-PC era, and the iPad is just, really dominating. And a lot of pundits say, and a lot of people who track the computer world say that one of the reasons that the PC has been stagnant is that people are buying iPads. And, Apple could be selling like 45 million iPads this year alone. And so Microsoft has to do something because it's not just the iPad, but in the smartphone market, Microsoft is not doing very well. Windows Phone stinks. Not many people are buying it. Instead, they're buying the iPhone and Android devices. So Microsoft has to do something big. And it looks like they're trying to be very original and ambitious with Windows 8. So Microsoft's going a different route. Basically, and I haven't played around with Windows 8 Preview. I am afraid to install it on Boot Camp on my iMac or my MacBook Air. But other sites, like I'm looking right now at thisismynext.com, which is going to be soon called The Verge, and Joanna Stern on September 13th had a very in-depth look at Windows 8, pictures, video, and hands-on preview of the developer build. But let me just tell you what my sense of Windows 8 is. Basically, Microsoft is going to have one operating system that's going to run on a traditional PC and also run on tablets. And so it's designed Windows 8 to be have touch screen capability. But the big thing with Windows 8 appears to be that it's going to have this like overlay so that it can work on tablet devices. But when people want to go back to the traditional look of a PC, from within that sort of touch, overlay that's like really designed for a tablet, you're going to be able to go back to a traditional looking computer interface. So the touch overlay is similar to what Microsoft has been doing with whatever the smartphone, the Windows 7 smartphone, and it looks like you have like touch navigation. You have sort of tiles that represent programs and apps. So, obviously Microsoft thinks it has to go the tablet route, but it's going in a very different route than Apple. Because what Apple's doing is Apple, had totally broke from the Macintosh operating system and when it went with the iPad. The iPad is more like the operating system. In fact, it is the operating system for the iPhone. So Apple has two operating systems, one for the Macintosh and one for the iPad. While Windows 8 is basically going to run both on a tablet device and a PC. So Microsoft's going the opposite route. It's going from the desktop to the tablet and bringing the desktop software to the tablet. And why is Microsoft going this route and Apple not? Well, a lot of people haven't focused on this, but it's purely business. Let's think about it. Apple has never had a significant market share in regular computers. The Macintosh has always been just a teeny small slice of the American PC market. In recent years, it's growing to maybe 9% or 8%, but for a long time it was at 5%. And what made Apple really successful in the last 10 years was the non-Macintosh products like the iPhone, and then first the iPod. It all started with the iPod in October 2001, and that's really what turned Apple around. And the iPod was a massive hit. Apple was selling devices and suddenly was dominant in some area of devices. Remember, the iPod it's almost like a monopoly for MP3s. And then really the iPod spawned the iPhone, and then the iPhone spawned the iPad. And Apple's been crazy successful with the iPhone and the iPad. So Apple is going to go with its strength. So its strength is the non-Macintosh devices. So if anything, Apple is not going to port Macintosh OS and run it on a tablet. Rather, if anything, the tablet is going to port over and eventually consume the computer. It's the flip opposite for Microsoft. Microsoft, for the last 20 years, has had a monopoly in PCs. It's had massive market share, 80, 90%. And that's its cash cow. So what is Microsoft going to do? It's not going to just abandon Windows when it goes to a tablet. No, that's its strength. Its strength is all these enterprise IT people who just are trained on Microsoft and business types. And so what Microsoft is hoping is to comfort them and say, look, you can get a tablet, but if you really want to run Windows, pure old-fashioned Windows on a tablet, you can do it with Windows 8 because it's going to have this like tablet overview, but then you're going to be able to go to traditional Windows. So really they're coming at tablets from opposite sides. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Windows 8. Now Windows 8 has some cool things. It's mentioned in this article by this is my last. It has something called contracts, and basically an app that's on Windows 8 can, I guess, allow itself to be contracted. And so another app can directly communicate with another app and share things. So, I'm not sure exactly how that works, but instead of sort of each app being sort of, on its own, the apps, even by different developers, can share information with each other. So I guess that would work like, well, in some ways that works like that in iOS, where some apps, Apple allows you through the API, some apps can take advantage of the photo library on an iPhone or iPad. And maybe contracts is something like that. So a lot of people have said that that's something cool. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that currently Windows 8 Developers Preview runs on tablets that are run on processors by Intel, but Microsoft made it clear that Windows 8 is also going to run on the ARM processors, which are what Android devices and the iPhone run on. And this is really kind of funny because Microsoft has been in an alliance with Intel for 2 decades. And Intel recently announced that Intel is going to make chips that work with Android, which is Google's open source operating system for smartphones. So what we do have is a split in the alliance between Microsoft and Intel. So, I mean, I think we're entering into a very interesting time in the computing world, because the old paradigms where Microsoft was in an alliance with Intel and the two dominated computers, that's coming to an end. Their alliance is split. Intel is making friends with Google and Android. Microsoft is making friends with another processor developer, ARM, and you have Apple dominating in the tablet market. You have Google also dominating in smartphones along with Apple. And so you've got really competitive market. And I've been saying this for a long time. I actually think Microsoft should hedge its bets and form an alliance or get along with Apple, because I think to some extent Microsoft is more threatened by Google and Android and its Chrome browser and all the free stuff that Google is providing online, which undermines Microsoft's business of selling software. Because Google is all about the cloud and Microsoft's all about selling software like Microsoft Office, Microsoft Windows. And so, I mean, I've said this before. I think Microsoft should make a version of Microsoft Office that runs on the iPad. I mean, and Apple has an interest in getting Microsoft to make Microsoft Office run on the iPad, because then it would increase Apple's ability to get the iPad into the enterprise for sale. So, we'll have to see what happens if Windows 8 is successful, if the Android tablets are successful, if the iPad continues to dominate. It's going to be an interesting time in the computing world. Now, we seem to be getting closer and closer to a big event from Apple. Apple is going to have some sort of big event where iOS 5 is announced, the new iPhone 5 is announced, and Apple finally launches iCloud. Right now, iCloud is in beta, and iCloud, which is going to be the revamped online service for the Macs and for the iOS devices, is going to be revealed. And Mac Rumors points out that, I guess today, September 16th, Apple released Apple's seed OS X 10.7.2 build 11C57 to developers. And basically what that means is Apple's getting closer to releasing an update to Lion that has iCloud integration and components in it. Now, what that's going to mean for the Mac is the Mac is going to be integrated with iCloud so that apps have automatic, syncing and backing up through the cloud to other companion apps, like, for example, Pages on the Mac will automatically sync with Pages on the iPad and the iPhone, and Apple will release the music, the matching service on iCloud, where it's going to just scan your music library, and you're going to have automatically, if you have those tracks in iTunes, you'll have them, for a small fee a year. I think it's like $25 a year. You're going to have 25,000 files without having to upload them if you have 25,000 files on your iTunes account. So this is coming up soon, and some of the apps that are going to be working with iCloud to begin with are going to be Address Book, iCal, iChat, Mail. So it should be interesting. Now, one thing people are eagerly waiting for is the update to the iPhone 5. And 9to5Mac has some news out on September 15th, which follows up on news from the New York Times. The New York Times this week didn't have any information that was new, but basically said that the iPhone 5 will be coming out in early October. But one thing that's been sort of confusing is exactly what kind of model of iPhone. Some people are saying it's going to be a radically new design, sort of a thinner model with a bigger screen that's teardropped. But then others are saying, no, there's going to be a model that's just like the iPhone 4, maybe with a metal back. Well, 9to5Mac basically says there's going to be both. So one rumor is that there is going to be a very cheap version of the iPhone that's like the iPhone 4, but that's going to have like a metal back, but be the same shape. But that there's going to be the more expensive version of the iPhone is going to be the iPhone 5, and that it's going to have a larger screen and be thinner and have a rounder body. But 9to5Mac says that Apple's having production problems with the iPhone 5, so it's not going to be available in large quantities, and there's going to be shortages till 2012. But interestingly, 9to5Mac says the iPhone 5 itself is a sight to behold, we've been told. It is, and this is what 9to5Mac says. It says it is impossibly light, yet much firmer than Samsung Galaxy phones, which are backed in plastic. I don't know if that's a correct word by them. And then it goes on to say the camera rivals point-and-shoot cameras and will be a major marketing point for this device. So this is going to be really interesting. I mean, I'm looking forward to upgrading. I've had the iPhone 4 since last June, I guess, and it's been a great device. But each iteration of the iPhone is just, raises the bar and makes the, it's just, the reason I'm going to upgrade right away is because every generation of the iPhone is just a much better computer. It's much faster and a much better camera. And I really use my iPhone now really as my main computer and my main camera. So I think it's going to be a hit, the iPhone 5, particularly if the camera is great and it's even faster. Obviously, it's going to be faster because it's going to have the A5 processor that's in the current iPad. So, now it's, September 16th. We're getting really, really close. One other thing that I hope that they do is I hope Apple launches a prepaid iPhone. In other words, what's very common in the rest of the world are cell phones and smartphones where you're not committed to a multi-year plan, but rather that you buy the phone and you just pay monthly or just pay by, buying some credit or time on the card, and that's it. And apparently most of the world operates like that. And so hopefully Apple is going to come out with a cheap iPhone, one that they can still make a profit, that has a prepaid plan. So, let's cross our fingers and hope that happens. Okay, so now if you're in the market for a new iMac, you may want to hold off because there is some information from 9to5Mac that new iMacs may be coming out in late 2011. And what 9to5Mac says is that some eagle-eyed commentators noted that the support document about Thunderbolt displays included an interesting addition. Apple says that the iMac mid-2011 and late 2011 can both support two Thunderbolt displays. And 9to5Mac points out that Apple currently only has one iMac and hasn't released a late 2000 iMac yet. So, I mean, they do point out that Apple released an educational-only iMac in August, which some call a late 2011 iMac, but Apple does not have any Thunderbolt ports on that one, so that doesn't make sense. So, who knows? There may be a refresh of the iMacs in late 2011. Now, I was thinking one basis to do a refresh of the iMac is that the current iMacs have internal eSATA ports that are 6G, which means that they can read and write at speeds of up to 500 megabytes per second. But the SSD drives that Apple allows you to order for the current iMacs are using the old 3G technology, which has read and write speeds of 250 megabytes. So maybe Apple is going to update the iMacs at the end of the year so that, among other things, they have the faster 6G SSD drives that have just come out. And that can make a big difference in speed. So maybe that's one of the things that will be upgraded in new iMacs. Now, the new MacBook Airs that came out this summer, they also have what it's known as 6G eSATA connections internally. And Apple ships the MacBook Air generally with like a Samsung SSD that runs on the 3G speed. So the current SSD drive that Apple puts into the MacBook Air doesn't take advantage of the full speed of the eSATA. So, for example, my SSD drive in my MacBook Air read-writes at 250 megabytes per second, which is very, very fast and much faster than a traditional hard drive. But Apple doesn't provide the faster 6G SSD. But this third-party company, OWC, yesterday announced that they have made available a self-install if you want to upgrade your own 2011 MacBook Air. And so they're selling now the Mercury Aurora Pro Express 6G SSD, which is they claim to be the industry's first 6G BPS. And I've become sort of obsessed with SSD because I'm just astounded by how fast my MacBook Air is. Even it's running the older 3G. And this is what OWC says on its blog. It says, Otherworld Computing announced today the industry's first 6G SSD upgrade for the 2011 MacBook Air 11.1 and 13.3-inch models. The new OWC Mercury Aurora Pro Express 6G SSDs combined award-winning SandForce technologies and Tier 1 Grade A toggle synchronous NAND to deliver data rates that are more than 3 times faster and capacities that are up to 4 times greater than factory-available SSD options. It goes on to say, currently available in 2 sizes, 120 gigabytes and 240 gigabytes, the new 6G SATA 3.0 revision models continue OWC's position as the only alternative to factory SSD options for the 2010 and 2011 MacBook Airs. So, if at some point you want to have a nice little speed bump on your 2011 MacBook Air, all you have to do is buy a replacement SSD from OWC. And they have a video, and apparently you can upgrade your SSD drive in your MacBook Air yourself. And basically what you do is you unscrew I think there's, 12 screws on the bottom perimeter of your MacBook Air, and then the lid comes off, and then you just unscrew one screw that keeps the sort of very thin hard drive slab SSD that's in there, and you just sort of pull it out of its socket and then replace it with a new SSD. So what I'm thinking of doing is, like, in a year or two, upgrading when the price of the 6G SSDs come down, and taking out my my 3G 120 gigabyte SSD that Apple installed. Now, what will I do with that? Well, as I mentioned last week, I shipped my 2010 iMac 27-inch to OWC, and right now it's en route back. And what I did is they have a turnkey upgrade solution for the 2010 iMac, as well as for the 2011 iMac. And basically, when I got my 2010 iMac last year, it was a refurbished model, and it just had a 1 terabyte hard drive, and I put extra RAM in it, but it feels sluggish compared to my MacBook Air. So I sent it for an upgrade. So what OWC has done is they've done two things. They have put into it an exterior serial a SATA port. So I'm going to have an eSATA port, 3G eSATA port, put in the bottom of the iMac. And in addition to that, I am having them put in a 115 gigabyte OWC Mercury Extreme Pro SSD, which is going to replace the little memory card reader in there. So I'm going to have an SSD drive in there, plus the ability to have an eSATA connection. And so in the future, if I ever remove the SSD drive that's in my MacBook Air, which is a 3G one, I can put it in an enclosure and connect it to the eSATA connection of my iMac. So I'm going to get the upgraded iMac tomorrow and do some tests on the speed. But OWC is a very good resource if you want to make your make your Mac hardware, whether it's an iMac or a MacBook Air, faster. So Apple's making some changes which hopefully will make your life easier. GigaOM, a website that I read a lot, has an article out called "Finally, One Apple ID to Rule Them On." So apparently, they point out that a lot of people have different Apple IDs. For example, he points out, the writer Daryl Irvington, he says, "There's my oldest Apple ID and iTunes account, which I've long used for making purchases through iTunes and app stores, and there's my MobileMe account, which will soon become an iCloud ID." And he goes on to say, "If I could just make my .me account my sign-in email for my existing Apple ID, all would be well, but that's not possible." But then he points out that Apple appears to be changing that. It looks like Apple is going to allow people to consolidate the different IDs. It goes on the article to say that one reader who emailed Apple CEO Tim Cook about the problem of multiple Apple IDs received a response from Apple's executive relations team by phone indicating that Apple was working on the issue. This comes from the Mac Rumors site, and the person acknowledged that as of yet you can't combine accounts, but that the Apple ID team is working on it. And somebody else, also a customer, reported receiving the same information after emailing Tim Cook, the CEO. So, I mean, this is good because, I have like a MobileMe, I have a .me email ID, and then I have a Mac one, and I'm sure there are people with multiple IDs, and it makes sense for Apple to sort of clean up the multiple different ways to log in. Now, GigaOM also points out something else could be unified, and it has an article entitled by the same writer, OS X Code suggests iMessage could come to iChat. Now, one thing that's kind of silly is Apple has different communication platforms on different devices, and it would be nice to unify it. For example, there's the FaceTime app on the Mac that also works with the FaceTime app on the iPad and the iPhone. But then we have the old iChat. iChat's still there. And iChat also, allows instant messaging. Well, iOS 5 will have iMessages. And what this article points out is that there's code which indicates that iMessage will work across all Apple hardware and may work with Lion's iChat. So look, what I would like personally is if there's just one app on the Mac that does messaging and video chatting and also works for FaceTime. I don't want to have to open up iChat for some stuff, email for other stuff, and FaceTime for something else. In fact, what Apple should do is have a unified communication device that will have your emails, your text messaging, and your FaceTime. That would be really cool. But for now, at least, it looks like they're unifying the iMessages in iChat. And, let's just hope the unification effort just continues, because we desperately need it. Now, one of the things that we're expecting in the fall is for Apple to release the iPhone on 2 additional networks in the United States, T-Mobile and Sprint. Now, the T-Mobile one might be moot because AT&T is trying to buy T-Mobile. But there's been a lot of resistance in preventing T-Mobile to be acquired by AT&T. A lot of people think it's anti-competitive. And frankly, I think it's not in Apple's interest for AT&T to buy T-Mobile, because the fewer carriers there are in the United States, the less leverage Apple has. For example, if there's 4 carriers and AT&T starts demanding things from Apple, let's say AT&T starts saying they want to brand iPhones with the AT&T label, Apple could say, no, we're leaving, we're not going to be on AT&T, but we can go to Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint. But if AT&T acquires T-Mobile, it'll be so dominant that Apple will lose some leverage vis-a-vis AT&T and will go back to the bad old ways. Well, word comes out now that in addition to the Justice Department suing AT&T to block the merger with T-Mobile, 7 state attorney generals have also sued AT&T, including the attorney generals from California, Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and Washington. So, personally, I would like to see AT&T stop from purchasing T-Mobile. I think having 4 carriers makes a better competition, and competition is ultimately good for consumers. Now, one thing that I don't think is going to happen is I don't think Apple is going to buy Sprint. Now, some people I listen to on podcasts and bloggers I follow say that Apple should buy Sprint, the cell phone company. After all, they say, Sprint will be the weakest of the 3 major carriers if AT&T purchases T-Mobile. They dream that it would be great if Apple not only sold the iPhone, but also provided a telephone and data service to it. Here is why it makes no sense. First, if Apple purchased Sprint, Apple would jeopardize losing its distribution of iPhones through Verizon and AT&T. Apple would be directly competing with Verizon Wireless and AT&T Wireless if Apple purchased Sprint. Verizon and AT&T would not stand by and let Apple compete with their businesses and at the same time sell iPhones for Apple. Apple couldn't afford to lose its distribution of iPhones through Verizon and AT&T, as it would immediately affect Apple's quarterly revenue and profits. Apple doesn't just gut its business to start another business. Apple gradually grows into a new business while getting out slowly out of the other business. Second, Sprint is not very profitable, and thus Apple will not purchase it, as Apple is highly profitable. Apple has an operating margin of over 30%, while Sprint's operating margin is only 0.15%. That is right. It's not 15%, but just barely over zero at 0.15%. Apple would be severely hurting its financial results if it purchased this highly unprofitable company, Sprint. Sprint had over $3 billion in losses in the last fiscal year. Apple doesn't purchase severely losing large businesses. The third reason why Apple shouldn't buy Sprint is that Apple is into reinventing a consumer space. If Apple provides wireless internet data to iPhones, it will do it through some other technology and not cell phone wireless access. Now, Jason Calacanis earlier this week, among other things, said that Apple should purchase Boingo, the wireless access service. Personally, I would like to see Apple spend a few $1 billion spreading the next generation of Wi-Fi technology. Supposedly, the next generation of Wi-Fi technology will allow long-range, that is miles of Wi-Fi access and high bandwidth. If Apple spreads such Wi-Fi access around the United States and sells iPod Touches and iPads that work on such Wi-Fi networks, consumers won't need cell phone access. Your iPhone, iPod Touch, and iPad will have phone service through the voice over IP, like the FaceTime app. The bottom line is there's no way that Apple will purchase Sprint. Now, speaking of AT&T, there's news out this week that AT&T is going to launch LTE on this Sunday, September 18th. This comes from a website called Fierce Wireless. LTE is their next generation high-speed data service. And this is what the quote is, that AT&T Mobility will launch its first 5 LTE markets this Sunday, September 18th. AT&T CFO John Stevens said during an appearance at the Bank of America Merrill Lynch Media, Entertainment, and Communications Conference. AT&T said in May that it will launch LTE service in Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. And it goes on to say the company expects to deploy LTE across 70 million POPs, I'm not sure what that is, in markets by year end. Now, what I said is that AT&T better get its act together and have 4G service across the country. Its fierce rival, Verizon, is blanketing 4G across its network. AT&T iPhone customers like me will bolt to Verizon if the iPhone 5 or future iPhone supports 4G data services, but it is only available on Verizon. So listen up, AT&T, don't be cheap, and bring 4G cell data to all of America. Okay, one browser that I am using more and more is the Google Chrome browser on my MacBook Air, and there's good news. Google has upgraded Chrome, so now there's there's support for Lion's full screen mode and animations. So this update just came out today, and according to cultofmac.com, it says that it will have the disappearing scroll bars that we're so used to in Lion, and it's just going to be more Lion compatible. So you should check it out and upgrade if you like Chrome. To me, it's a very snappy browser that more and more competes with my use of Safari on the Mac. Okay, so finally, here's a tip. If you're into gaming, you might want to check out the Steam store. Steam is the online game store, because between now and September 20th, they're giving away Portal, which is a great game for the Macintosh, for free. So all you have to do is go there and install the game. I guess there's a Windows version too. So that's the software tip for today. Go and install Portal because it's free on the Mac through September 20th. Finally, there's a very interesting story in the Register, a British website or newspaper, and basically the title of it is Google Shamed by Apple in Race to HTML5. Now, here's what's interesting about the article. It makes a very interesting point. Everybody thinks that Apple is into native apps on iOS devices like the iPhone and the iPad and is shunning the web. And the web is really now, the modern web is HTML5, which is the code and standard, to make really compelling interactive websites. But what the Register is claiming is that actually Apple has done a much better job at supporting HTML5 on iOS devices like the iPhone and iPad than Google, and that Google, which is supposed to be the big defender of the web, has done a poor job implementing HTML5 on its Android devices, and that Android devices don't run the web in HTML5 as well as Apple's iOS devices. And this is really an interesting and startling accusation, and I think one that makes sense. It basically says that Apple has optimized its hardware for HTML5, and that's why browsers run better on the iOS devices than on Android. This is what he says, the writer of this article, Matt Essay. He says, part of the reason HTML5 apps perform much better on Apple devices is because Apple long ago invested in hardware acceleration, whereas Google only got around to it in version 3.0 of Android. And he goes on to say, and then there's just general browser performance. On the desktop, Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, or even Microsoft Internet Explorer regularly trounce Apple's Safari in performance tests, as well as extensively of the browser through plugins and extensions. But in mobile, Apple's Safari blows everyone else away, as recent research shows. So he makes this point. He says, in other words, even the web is better on Apple devices despite Apple's preference for native apps. Google should be doing better. Perhaps the reason it isn't comes down to a confused mobile strategy. So this is very profound and interesting, and just goes to show you, everybody had these preconceived notions that Apple's not into the web and into native apps, but the experience on the iPhone and iPad with the web is superior to that on Android devices. Okay, so that's it for the Apple Podcast, episode 89, September 16th, 2011. And hopefully we'll have a lot more Apple news in the coming week. Thanks for listening. This is Lex at MacFuture.com. This is a chit-chat-free podcast, and you can always get added to Google Plus if you email me at maxfuture@gmail.com, and I'll send you an invitation. So thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This has been a Max Future production.